Hello, and welcome to this lecture on agriculture. Farming started 10,000 to 12,000 years ago with the Neolithic Revolution in the Fertile Crescent. This time period is also called the First Agricultural Revolution. Several other regions of the world invented agriculture shortly after, and the technology spread to other regions as well. Early on, populations were small, and farming was subsistence-based. People would grow food on a small plot of land and then move the plot once the soil was depleted of nutrients, which gave the small area of land that was disturbed time to recover. The Neolithic Revolution took place during the Stone Age, and people used stone tools at the time. They domesticated plants and animals, but the exact species varied by region. For example, rice was common in the East, while maize was common in the Americas. During this time, the first wooden plow was developed, along with crop irrigation. Each technological breakthrough increased the abilities of farmers, and they were able to produce more food reliably. This allowed humans who had all been hunter-gatherers up to that point to settle in one spot, and populations increased as food sources, which had been a common limiting resource, became more stable. But farming didn't always take the form of cropland in a specific spot. Many regions depended on nomadic herding. This type of lifestyle is called pastoralism, and involves allowing domesticated animals, or livestock, onto vegetated lands to graze. Early on, it was practiced by nomadic people who moved with herds of cattle, camels, goats, yaks, llamas, reindeer, horses, and sheep. Obviously, the particular animal depends on the region, and some people today still practice this lifestyle. As human societies developed, so did agricultural inventions. Post-Neolithic societies continued to make improvements to farming tools, built new instruments, and began using animals in new ways. Here's a list of the innovations after the Neolithic era as human civilizations continued to grow. You can see that stone tools were replaced by metal ones, a number of new tools and aqueducts were invented, and animals were used for work and their waste used for fertilizer. You don't need to know the exact dates that any of these things happened, simply that humans continued to innovate new ways to increase the productivity of farms, and with increasing yields, they were able to support larger and larger populations. In the mid-1600s, a second agricultural revolution occurred in Britain, hence the name the British Agricultural Revolution. During the Second Agricultural Revolution, there was an increase in agriculture due to increases in labor, productivity, and transportation. There were many technological advances that led to increased productivity at this time. For example, new tools and mechanisms, such as improvements to the plow, refining the seed drill, and the development of a threshing machine, pictured to the right here, made planting, harvesting, and processing crops much more efficient and streamlined. A four-course crop rotation was also developed. Farmers began to rotate crops on the fields they used by planting crops in a certain order that would restore nutrients in the soil. This replaced the medieval three-field system that actually required the fields to remain fallow, that means unplanted, for a year, so it greatly increased crop yields. Selective breeding was also introduced as a scientific practice during this time frame. This was used to stabilize certain aspects of genetic diversity to increase the amount of food that was produced. The main consequence of the British Agricultural Revolution was a large-scale shift from subsistence to commercial agriculture, and food started to last year-round. As a result, the population of England and Wales increased from 5.5 million to over 9 million people over the next century. And of course, the technology spread out from Britain as well. There have been further agricultural advances since the British Agricultural Revolution. Since 1700, the steel plow was invented, and genetics and evolution are now well understood and routinely applied to farming and livestock. Additionally, canning, pasteurization, and refrigeration were all invented, which lengthened the shelf life of food, and perhaps most importantly, the Haber-Bosch process was invented. The Haber-Bosch process is named for Fritz Haber, who discovered how to fix atmospheric nitrogen using high temperature and pressure, and Carl Bosch, who scaled up the process. Nitrogen fixation involves taking atmospheric nitrogen, which is N2, and turning it into ammonia, which is a usable form by plants. Atmospheric nitrogen makes up approximately 78% of the atmosphere, but it's unusable by most organisms on the planet because the two nitrogen atoms are tightly bound together by a triple bond. Nitrogen fixation is only carried out naturally by either certain microorganisms or from infrequent abiotic processes such as lightning strikes. But the Haber-Bosch process changed that and allowed for the development of synthetic fertilizers that increased agricultural yields. You can see from the graph on the right that human population began increasing exponentially shortly after the Haber-Bosch process was invented, and agricultural productivity increased. Starting in about 1850, grasslands were plowed to grow grain for the world's urban populations. It began in the Eurasian steppe, which is present-day Russia and Ukraine, In the 19th and 20th century, the plow-up spread to the Great Plains of North America, the veldt of southern Africa, lands in Australasia, northern India, North Africa, and the plains of Hungary and Romania. This plow-up was made possible by the transportation revolution, which involved the development of railroads, cargo ships, and ports, and so on. Unfortunately, many indigenous populations across the world were forcibly driven off lands. Ecological disasters have also been a consequence following the plow-up, because the plow-up destroyed many ecological protections that maintain soil integrity. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s in the US is an example of an ecological disaster that resulted from the Great Plow-up. The Great Plow-up in the US was really made possible by the discovery of the Ogallala Aquifer in 1889. This massive underground reservoir of water really allowed for the large-scale irrigation that the crops that were planted during the Great Plow-up needed. The lower map shows where corn is grown in the US, and the map on the right shows you the Ogallala Aquifer. There is a significant overlap in terms of which states were plowed to be dominated by farms and where the aquifer is located. The massive underground reservoir of water really allowed for large-scale irrigation for the plow to take place in the US. Unfortunately, its recharge rate is slower than the rate at which we have been utilizing its water. The areas shaded in red and yellow in the map have been declining in terms of water levels. The Green Revolution is the third agricultural revolution, and it began in North America in the mid-1900s. Several industrial changes contributed to this revolution. For example, large-scale mechanization of planting, harvesting, and processing of crops increased yields greatly. Chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides also increased the yields of farms. Food manufacturing breakthroughs, such as canning and packaging, also increased the shelf life of food so that it could be distributed or kept for longer. Another factor that contributed to the Green Revolution was the development of new varieties of rice, wheat, and corn due to advances in plant breeding and genetic manipulation. These breakthroughs led to large increases in crop production in developing countries. This decreased famine in numerous areas, including hunger areas. However, world hunger and malnourishment, where people don't get all the nutrients they need due to a limited diet, are still a very big problem today. But it isn't because we don't currently produce enough food. We just don't distribute it to the areas or to the people that need it effectively. So we've gone over the broad strokes of agricultural history. Let's talk about some of the many different types of agriculture that are practiced worldwide today and their impact on ecosystems. We spoke briefly about subsistence farming earlier in this lecture when we talked about farming during different agricultural revolutions, but it is still practiced today around the world. To give you a good definition, subsistence farming is a form of farming in which nearly all crops or livestock are raised for the sole purpose of feeding the farmer and their family. Tools are simple with heavy reliance on human labor. It is practiced on small pieces of land because all work is done by the farmer and their family, and so there is low overall productivity and the potential for quite minimal impact on the environment. Many subsistence farmers are poor, and because of this, the land that they have access to may have low soil fertility or have rough terrain. In other words, it's land that isn't as desirable. Intensive subsistence agriculture is the most abundant type of subsistence agriculture and has greater environmental effects than less intensive forms. The work is still largely labor-based with simple tools, and the plots of land are still small. It's commonly practiced in humid tropical regions with high densities of people. And as the name implies, farmers work the land very hard, and because of the year-round growing season, because it's usually in the tropics, they can often get 2 harvests per year. This is also known as double cropping. Rice is a very common crop for intensive subsistence agriculture. Another type of agriculture that is often subsistence-based is slash and burn with shifting cultivation. With slash and burn agriculture, plots of land are cleared by slashing or cutting them back and then burning them prior to farming. Burning takes the organic matter of the vegetation that was cut back and returns it to the soil. The farm is worked for a few years until the soil fertility declines, and then the farmer prepares a new plot of land. This is a very common technique in tropical regions where soil fertility can actually be quite low, and so burning before planting is very important. When this technique is subsistence-based, it isn't as destructive as it sounds because only a small plot of land is worked for a few years, and once the farmer moves, the surrounding ecosystem quickly takes over again. It doesn't fragment the habitat because it is a little island of a farm in a much bigger forest. But if this technique is practiced on large scales, it can permanently change and damage the landscape. Pastoral nomadicism is another type of agriculture that we spoke about earlier that is still practiced today. It's a form of subsistence farming in which nomadic people roam with and tend grazing herds that support their family. The grazing animals are kept on natural pastures rather than a ranch, and people and animals migrate, sometimes over large territories. This way of life is still common in arid and semi-arid regions such as Saudi Arabia, Northern Africa, and Eurasia. Let's switch gears now and speak about commercial agriculture, sometimes called industrialized agriculture. With this method of agriculture, farmers produce crops with high commercial value, with the intent to sell the crops. Farms are typically quite large because they have to grow enough produce to turn a profit. There is a heavy reliance on mechanized equipment and chemical inputs such as fertilizers, pesticides, and antibiotics. These things all increase the yield and streamline the planting, harvesting, and processing of crops, so it can be done faster. Obviously, large areas of land are destroyed to make way for cropland. Water is often overdrawn in order to water the crops as well. Additionally, the soil can be depleted of nutrients, and the chemical inputs such as pesticides can contaminate surrounding ecosystems and waterways. Livestock ranching, also known as pastoral farming, is a type of commercial agriculture with a focus on rearing animals for meat or dairy. Unlike pastoral nomadicism, the farmers remain in one place and the pasture lands are developed for grazing, like pastures or rangeland. Rangelands are natural ecosystems such as prairies that contain native vegetation that grazers eat, while pasture lands are seeded, fertilized, and irrigated by humans. Over 27% of the lower contiguous 48 states is privately owned range or cropland. 17% more of the lower contiguous 48 states is privately owned grazing land on landscapes that are classified as other. These are things like forests, grazed croplands, or more. So that is more than 44% of the lower contiguous 48 states that is privately owned and used for grazing livestock. However, grazing is also allowed on federal lands run by the Bureau of Land Management, and many livestock ranchers have permits to graze their livestock on them. As you can imagine, continued grazing greatly impacts the ecosystem. The intensity of grazing will affect how negatively ecosystems are affected. The intensity of the grazing will affect how much the ecosystems are affected. Habitat destruction takes place when natural landscapes are made into pastures or when livestock is grazed on natural raised land. But perhaps the biggest consequence is livestock waste, which contaminates waterways. This becomes a very big problem when cattle and livestock are concentrated in an area such as on a feedlot. I wanted to show you some images of industrial animal farming. As you can see, it can be quite high density and abusive to animals. These are not particularly graphic images either. Many animals are kept in small cages. The chickens on the bottom left are cage-free chickens. You can see that they still live indoors in extremely cramped conditions. I also wanted to show you some images of industrial cattle ranching specifically. Again, the animals can be concentrated onto small feedlots. This is especially true on dairy farms. All of the pictures here and on the previous slide are situations that have large environmental consequences due to habitat destruction and the concentration of animal waste. Mixed farming is a technique that involves growing crops and rearing animals together on the same piece of land. The idea is that the different parts should act together as a whole, such as the animal waste acting as fertilizer. There is continuous cropping because different crops are planted with a variety of maturity periods, so that farmers are always harvesting something. This technique is common in many areas. Organic farming is a type of farming that excludes or strictly limits the use of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and livestock feed additives like antibiotics. So many of the chemical innovations that were developed during the Green Revolution are limited or banned. This method of farming relies on crop rotation and composting to regenerate soil nutrients, biological pest control, and other natural techniques. People often confuse organic farming with sustainable agriculture. Organic farming uses less chemicals, but that does not necessarily make it sustainable. Sustainable agriculture focuses on providing food over the long term, so being able to grow it now in addition to 100 years from now. It combines farming with the principles of ecology, such as the natural biological cycles of plants or rain patterns. The methods that are used in sustainable agriculture are designed to protect the environment so that it can continue to be farmed in the near and far future. It involves fewer chemicals, water conservation, selecting crops that are appropriate for the location, specifically the moisture levels of that location, and using energy-efficient techniques. Sustainable agriculture seems to go back to the basics in a lot of ways, using less energy and no pesticides, but it really uses all the knowledge that we have gained up to this point regarding farming and ecology. So we've talked about some broad-scale changes in agriculture over time and with some different current methods that are practiced today, and we've touched on some of the consequences of agriculture, but let's list them here specifically. Agriculture has huge consequences for natural habitats. Deforestation is a consequence of increased agriculture and wood harvesting. This bar plot shows that 50% of the Earth's habitable land is used for agriculture, of which 77% is used for raising livestock. Agriculture also results in huge quantities of water being diverted from natural ecosystems, and it overdraws from a lot of these water sources. Habitat destruction and water overdraw also results in biodiversity loss. Agriculture also has many consequences for the soil. Intensive agriculture uses up soil nutrients as the plants pull them through their roots and put them into their tissues. It also causes soil erosion, soil salination, in which water soluble salts accumulate, and an accumulation of pesticides. In terms of water, agricultural runoff is associated with eutrophication. Eutrophication happens when certain pollutants that contain nutrients such as fertilizers enter waterways and induce dense phytoplankton growth. The algae turns clear, clean water into murky algal soup, blocking light levels in the water. Eutrophication also decreases dissolved oxygen in the water because as the algae dies, it sinks, and microbial decomposers respire the algal organic matter using any and all dissolved oxygen. This results in massive die-offs of all oxygen-requiring aquatic organisms, such as fish. When agricultural waste, which includes a lot of fecal matter, flows into waterways, it provides even more organic matter for microbial decomposers to respire. Pesticides are another issue. These chemicals are harmful to more than just pests, and aquatic organisms frequently suffer. Diversions of rivers and streams and the overdrawing of groundwater is also detrimental to aquatic environments because it decreases the amount of water natural habitats receive. And overuse results in gully erosion, shown in the bottom left picture. This bar plot shows the freshwater withdrawals per kilogram of food product. You can see that cheese requires the most water, followed by nuts. It makes sense that farmed fish and prawns would require a lot of water, given that they are aquatic organisms. Then beef is up there, followed by rice. Hormones and antibiotics are frequently given to livestock to increase their growth. These medicines are an issue because they wind up in surrounding ecosystems and in waterways. Hormones are known to harm animals like amphibians and fish, which have permeable skin. Additionally, the antibiotics are contributing to bacterial antibiotic resistance. So eliminating unneeded medicine is best for the environment. The map shows the antibiotic use in livestock for different countries as of 2010. The US and many other nations are well above the target of 50 milligrams per kilogram of meat produced, which is normalized to a population corrected unit. The figure on the right is a poster made by the Center for Disease Control demonstrating how overuse of antibiotics in livestock contributes to antibiotic resistance. Basically, the natural bacteria that animals carry undergo selection, where the bacteria that are vulnerable to antibiotics die and the ones that are resistant survive and multiply. These bacteria spread and can infect humans. These are particularly detrimental infections because they are unaffected by many of the antibiotic treatments that we have available because we've already selected for the ones that are resistant to it. Agriculture also has consequences for the air. In addition to affecting water quality, pesticides affect air quality. Habitat degradation and soil erosion also affect air quality. Dust particles can easily become airborne when it becomes windy. Perhaps one of the best known examples of this was during the Dust Bowl, in which the drought-stricken southern plains of the US, which had significant soil erosion due to poor farming practices, suffered severe dust storms during the 1930s. High winds and dust storms swept over a massive region of the US and caused crop die-offs and illnesses and uprooted farmers. Finally, agriculture also affects waste generation and greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are emitted by farming equipment and vehicles that are used to transport food, in addition to the animals themselves. The bar graph on the right shows that 26% of global greenhouse emissions are due to food production, along with a breakdown of how different food production activities contribute. Other forms of waste also result from farming. We've spoken about how cattle, particularly cattle feedlots, create massive pollution, but many crops also make a significant amount of waste. For example, stalks or husks from harvested plants. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the greenhouse gases produced by agriculture, because certain animals contribute very greatly themselves. Ruminants like cows and sheep actually produce large amounts of methane due to fermentation that occurs in their stomachs. This methane escapes during burps and when they pass gas. Methane is actually a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It causes more warming per molecule of gas. The figure on the right shows the carbon footprint, which means the amount of carbon that is put into the atmosphere for different types of food. Beef and lamb are at the top, partly because they produce methane in their guts. But you'll notice there's a really wide range of carbon footprints depending on exactly how and where ranching takes place and what diet the animals are fed. If the farm is local and the meat isn't shipped from far away, it will have a lower carbon footprint. You can see that farmed fish and protein-rich plants have the lowest carbon footprint. So now that we know a lot of the environmental issues associated with agriculture, what are some of the solutions? In terms of soil, let's first consider how crops deplete nutrients. While fertilizers rectify this, they are expensive and can contaminate surrounding ecosystems and waterways. So a fairly easy fix is to grow crops that have a mutualistic relationship with nitrogen-fixing microorganisms, like legumes. Legumes have a mutualistic relationship with nitrogen-fixing microorganisms that live within their root nodules. The microorganisms are supplied with sugars from the plant, and the microbes give the plant usable nitrogen. This is actually what the four-course crop rotation that was invented during the British Agricultural Revolution achieved by planting legumes during one of its rotations. So a farmer doesn't have to exclusively grow legumes, they just need to rotate the crop in every few years. There are also many ways to address soil stability to prevent erosion. Careful water delivery can prevent gully erosion. For example, rather than using a standard sprinkler system that puts a lot of water on the crops all at once, a farmer could use a drip irrigation, which slowly delivers it to the roots. This decreases the overall water used and the amount of runoff. Agroforestry is when trees and shrubs are integrated into farms, or farms may actually be planted in forests themselves. The roots stabilize the soil, and the canopy and cover prevent strong winds and rain from sweeping the soil away. The trees have the added benefit of creating moisture conditions due to evapotranspiration. Here's a list of some common different field design techniques that reduce soil loss. Strip cropping is when ground cover plants like grasses are planted in strips between fields of crops. These strips soak up rain and slow runoff. Windbreaks are another common design method that greatly decreases erosion. The rows of trees, which are planted between fields, slow down the wind and reduce erosion. Terracing is a design technique in which step-like terraces are built on slopes. These terraces prevent runoff from rushing downhill and washing the soil away. Contour cropping is the last field design technique we'll cover. Crops are planted in curving rows to follow the contour of the hills. This slows the runoff as well, which reduces erosion. There are also some farming methods, such as no-till planting. This is when seeds are planted in the ground without plowing the soil. Dead plants from the previous crop remain on and in the ground, root structure and all. Their roots actually hold the soil in place. Finally, the last farming technique that we'll cover is cover crops. With this method, fields are planted year-round, even during seasons when crops don't grow, and the reason for this is that the root structure and cover that the plant provides stops wind and water from washing the soil away during the off-season. There are also many solutions for water overdraw and water contamination. First, we'll talk about ways to reduce or eliminate water overdraw. First and foremost, many farmers simply use too much water. They dump extra water on crops so that it pours off of fields and into nearby waterways. This is a problem for surrounding ecosystems as well. An obvious one for water overdraw is selecting appropriate crops for the climate. If a farm exists in an area with little water, then it should have crops that also require little water. Drip irrigation is also a highly effective way to reduce the amount of water that a farm requires. Rather than be sprayed randomly from above, water is delivered directly to the base of the plant, where the water can be soaked up by roots. There are also many clever ways that farms have invented for capturing and storing rainwater so that it can be used rather than overdrawing from aquifers or rivers. Having an intelligent irrigation schedule is also helpful. A lot of farmers water during the day because that's when they are working. But watering at night means the water won't evaporate away as quickly, and so less has to be applied. Finally, many of the field designs that help to prevent erosion can also be helpful with retaining water, such as terracing. It turns out that many of the methods that help with water overdraw and overuse also help with water contamination by crop farmers because water is not running off of fields into the waterways. Now, the issue with high-density cattle and dairy farms remains. The best solution for that is to have fewer animals on actual rangeland rather than feedlots or small pastures. That means fewer overall animals, and they are spread out. Natural ecosystems are well adapted to processing the waste from a couple grazers that pass through, but they're not capable of processing waste from thousands of animals in a small area. However, for feedlots, storage lagoons with liners are also an option. Obviously, there are a lot of issues with the abundant use of chemicals in modern agriculture. Ideally, fewer chemicals should be used. This can start with no longer giving hormones and antibiotics to livestock. That doesn't include giving a sick animal antibiotics. I'm referring to the medicines that are given to livestock so that they will grow more. But chemicals are also applied to crops to prevent pests, and the best solution for this is something called integrative pest management. This involves preventative cultural practices, which means using varieties best suited for local growing conditions and maintaining healthy crops while also quarantining infected plants. It also involves regular monitoring so that the farmer can act early, and also understanding that there are acceptable levels of pests on a plant, and putting the emphasis on control rather than eradication. There's also mechanical controls for when pests exceed acceptable levels, and this could be as simple as hand picking, or it could be more involved, like vacuuming them off a plant. Then there are also biological controls, such as natural predators that eat pests, or biological insecticides that are produced by microbes that can be used. Then, as a last resort, is chemical synthetic insecticides. These are used sparingly due to the harm that they cause to many animals and the ecosystems. Finally, eating lower on the food chain can help solve a lot of the issues with soil, water, and excessive greenhouse gas production. Recall this bar plot, which shows that 50% of the Earth's habitable land is used for agriculture, of which 77% is used for raising livestock. That's because livestock are primary consumers, while crops are primary producers. Consumers have to eat the trophic level below it, and only about 10% of the energy is transferred. So they have to eat much more than the pounds that they actually pack on. Eating lower in the food chain would mean that less habitat is diverted towards agriculture. More intact ecosystems would mean less biodiversity loss, and soil would remain intact because humans wouldn't be removing the natural protections that a healthy ecosystem has in place to retain that soil. For water, recall that cheese and livestock are also the top water consumers, so less water would be diverted and also polluted if people ate less meat. So recall that some crops use much less water than others. Finally, livestock produce the most greenhouse gases, both directly via digestive processes and indirectly through the infrastructure needed for that industry to continue. So eating lower on the food chain creates less greenhouse gases as well. Thank you very much.